So continuing our video exploration of this question of how to read the messages on this website and Christian mystical literature more generally, I'd like to look at an issue which I think is very important, but which hasn't necessarily received all that much specific attention. And that's the question of our own a priori assumptions that we bring to our discernment process as we try to evaluate both texts and events. Now, I'm going to use this term a priori quite a lot in what follows. So I think I need to define it at the outset. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about preconceived notions that we have, our premises, our working premise for any kind of exercise in which we're trying to make a judgment. The difference between a priori and a posteriori reasoning is that a posteriori things are the conclusions that we've reached after we've actually assessed a given question. Whereas a prioris come before we've done our inquiry. Now, the views that we bring to any question may be true, they may be false, but they are not the result of an inquiry. They simply are assumptions. And it's important to recognise that they are assumptions and not objective truth. And it's when we fail to do that, then we can easily go down the wrong path. So, in order to show why this is important in a theological context, I'd like to look at last Saturday's Gospel, which is John chapter 7, verses 40 to 52, in which both the crowds, so the people of Jesus' time, and the religious elite, the authorities, were faced by a question of discernment. So the same issues that we're facing. Faced with Jesus, where does this guy come from? Who is he? Is he the Christ? And as you'll see, there was a big debate about this. And I want to have a look at some of the ways in which they tried to answer the question, because the methods were different. And why some of them got it right and some of them got it wrong. So let's start by reading the passage. John chapter 7, verses 40 through 52. Some in the crowd who heard these words of Jesus said, "This is truly the prophet." Others said, "This is the Christ." But others said, "The Christ will not come from Galilee, will he? Does not Scripture say that the Christ will be of David's family and come from Bethlehem, the village where David lived?" So a division occurred in the crowd because of him. Some of them even wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. So the guards went to the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked them, "Why did you not bring him?" The guards answered, "Never before has anyone spoken like this man." So the Pharisees answered them, "Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities of the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd, which does not know the law, is accursed." Nicodemus, one of their members who had come to Jesus earlier, said to them, "Does our law condemn a man before it first hears him and finds out what he is doing?" They answered and said to him, "You're not from Galilee also, are you? Look and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Well, the reason why I chose this passage is that Pope Francis preached on Saturday during the televised Mass, which is happening now on a daily basis at 7 a.m, or it can be later in the day if you want to find it on replay, which has become a really precious resource for those of us who are currently living in strict confinement. And I found it actually wonderful to be able to tune in and, apart from anything else, improve my Italian, although perhaps I will end up speaking Italian with an Argentinian accent. And in his homily on this text, Pope Francis, I think, made some very important points. And the first thing that he said was that the Pharisees refused Jesus on an a priori basis. Their assumptions about who the Messiah should be just simply didn't have room for who Jesus was. And that's a very powerful point. He went on to say that the reason for this, the essential reason, was that they were intellectual snobs who despised the people and set themselves up as a kind of star chamber or a group apart, precisely because they'd forgotten that they themselves belonged to the people. So the issue at stake was pride, a lack of humility. And that is, of course, the essential point of the passage. If I want to use that as a kind of springboard for what we're going to say here, I would just like to say the same thing in slightly different terms, in a way using the language of philosophy, and of, to use a big word, epistemology, which is the study of how we know, or what we think we know. To say that the pride of the Pharisees resulted in a logical error, and that these two questions of spiritual state and mental reasoning are actually very much connected. So, what was the reasoning of those who objected to Jesus? The naysayers had a very simple argument. It went something like this. We know from the scriptures that Christ is going to come from Bethlehem. That's the crowd saying this. And that no prophet comes from Galilee. That's what the Pharisees said. Well, Jesus comes from Galilee. Ipso facto, he cannot be the Messiah. End of argument. Also, they thought. Well, obviously, for us who call ourselves Christians, they made a mistake. But what was the nature of that mistake? Well, it wasn't, curiously, that their knowledge was wrong. Their knowledge was right. If you look in the book of the prophet Micah, you will find the statement that Bethlehem will be the place from where the Messiah will come. At least that's how Scripture interprets that piece of the Hebrew Scriptures. And that was correct. However, where they went wrong was assuming that this knowledge, correct though it was complete, because it wasn't. They didn't take into account a possibility which they'd overlooked, which was that Jesus had been born in Bethlehem and then had moved to Galilee. Now, of course, if they'd known that, then they might have said something different. But the fact that they didn't think of it also results from the fact that their own assumptions were so closed that they didn't think that there was anything that Jesus could do or any information about him that could come out which could challenge them. Now, in technical terms, to use the language of philosophy, you could say that they gave a priority to hermeneutics, which is our interpretation of texts, as opposed to phenomenology, which is the study of phenomena, including events. Now, clearly, Jesus was a phenomenon in his time. Remember the words of the guards when they defended their action in not bringing Jesus to the Pharisees. They said, well, nobody has ever spoken like this man. In other words, Jesus is phenomenal. He is a phenomenon. And faced with this phenomenon, including, of course, the miracles of Jesus, the crowd had to know, or had to try and work out how to react. And they chose a different way of approaching the subject from that of the Pharisees. Now, of course, when I say they chose a way of approaching the subject, of course, they were normally acting on intuition. You're talking about simple people. And in the Gospels, it's always the simple people who have a much easier time of accepting Jesus, just as a child accepts the kingdom, in the words of Christ himself, than the Pharisees. They're doing this all on an intuitive basis because most of us aren't aware of the reasons why we react and reason in the way that we do. That's why the study of epistemology and analytic philosophy exists, is to try and zero in on the question of, okay, we think like this, but why do we think like this? What's our actual mental process in coming to the decisions that we come to? So the Pharisees went with the discipline of hermeneutics, in other words, their interpretation of text, whereas the crowd went with the observation of the phenomena. Their approach was to say, hang on, this guy's doing miracles. These miracles can only be done by somebody who is inspired by God, who has the power of God. Therefore, he must be the Messiah. So it's a completely different way of reasoning from the reasoning of the Pharisees. But it was the crowd, the simple folk, who got it right, and the Pharisees who got it wrong. Now, if you want to look at that a little bit more technically, you could say that the problem was that the a priori assumptions of the Pharisees had become so closed that they were not capable of accommodating new data. Now, that's a scientific way of looking at things in terms of the way that science progresses. And here you could think of the great textbook on that, which was taught by Thomas Kuhn, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which says that scientific revolutions come about when scientific theories have to be changed because of new data. But normally there's a period of conflict in which some scientists will say, hang on, look, we've observed some phenomena that suggest that our theory is wrong. But a bunch of people who've built their careers on the old theory are going to push back against that, because in fact their social prestige is going to be in question if they have to retract what they've built a whole career out of affirming. And that period of tension is actually a very difficult time. And you can see that in fact Jesus' life was precisely this period of tension, that his disciples, the people who accepted him, basically said, look, our way of conceiving what we thought about the Messiah is wrong because Jesus is showing us new data. He is the new datum, in fact, which is bringing the theory into question. But we're going to go with him because it's pretty obvious that he has the power of God. The Pharisees couldn't do that because they had the social prestige. They were the ones who had built their authority on their interpretation of the law. So, in fact, if they allowed this new understanding to take hold, they were going to be very threatened by it. And that, it seems, is the reason why they chose to reject Jesus, despite the fact that his miracles were clear and occurring before their eyes. Now, as we're talking about science, I'd like to give us perhaps an amusing example of how even a genius can be misled by a priori assumptions. And that genius is Albert Einstein himself, the great man. I don't wish to denigrate him, but I just want to point to a question in which even a genius can get it wrong because they are too wedded to their preconceived notion. Now, this came about in the mid 20th century when Albert Einstein was involved in questions of the nascent discipline of quantum physics. And there was a phenomenon that Einstein didn't like, which we call quantum entanglement, which is the very strange phenomenon that particles, which are spatially separated, behave in a way which suggests that they're somehow coordinated at a distance. They can change their spin simultaneously. According to the theory of Einstein's time, that ought not to be possible, because Einstein said this, if it was true, this would be spooky action at a distance. And in German, that's spukhafte Fernwirkung, which I think sounds much better than the English. But the English is what's gone down, of course, in history because of the nature of scientific publication, most of which is in English. Spooky action at a distance. Einstein said that's what the implication would be, and I'm not going to accept it. And he fought the notion of quantum entanglement for a long time, in fact. But he proved to be wrong. He was proved wrong because instrumental observation and measurement eventually proved that this phenomenon was actually occurring. And not only was it occurring, but it was occurring at great distances when the communication between the particles, if something like that is actually occurring, would have to occur at a speed faster than the speed of light. Now that's really counterintuitive because it seems to violate a basic principle of physics. But our instruments of measurement tell us that it is true. So, the conflict is between the instruments of measurement, the objective forms of measurement that we have, and a scientific theory. Now, it seems to me that only a klutz is going to go with the theory and say, well, your instruments are wrong. But that's often what we do. And it's what the Pharisees did. Remember, when Jesus healed, he sometimes said, go to the doctors. Show that what has happened is an objective healing. It's not just that you feel better mentally. It's something objective. And present that as evidence. The Pharisees wouldn't accept the objective data. When you do that, then you risk running into serious error. Now, in the final section of this video, I'm going to try and apply that principle of the observation of data against a preconceived notion to say, perhaps this is a tool by which we can evaluate things like apparitions and the messages that are connected with them. So stay tuned, I think it's going to be a wild ride, but hopefully you'll find something useful in what I'm about to say.